Okay, well, hello there, my friend, and welcome to Book Talks with Keith. I'm your host, Keith Brown, and I am so very privileged that you have taken the time out of your schedule to listen to this podcast. I've been doing a few solo episodes recently, but I am very grateful that I have a guest on today, because you know that one of the things that I love to do is introduce you to authors, because I think authors need to help each other, and I love doing that. So today, I want to introduce an author by the name of Marco Gamboa. Hi, Marco. Welcome to Book Talks with Keith.
Hey, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you,
Well,
and love the opportunity.
well, you are welcome. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. And Marco and I spoke just a moment before I hit record, and I told him that one of the things that I think is important as readers is every chance we can to get familiar with the authors in which we want to read. So I think it's really a good idea for authors to tell us a little bit about themselves. So, Marco, uh, give us the cliff note. Who is Marco Camboa?
Sure. I am a new author. I just published a book. It was the end of 23, so pretty much been spending all of 24 promoting the book. Currently working on a second book. I'm co-authoring with I don't know how much I'm allowed to say, but there's a comedian who got a hold of my book and said, "Hey, I love what you did. Can we try to do something funny?" And I said, "That's not really my wheelhouse, but I love exercising muscles that I don't have." And so I said, "Yeah, absolutely." But yeah, so I've written, someone who journaled a good chunk of their life, and I got really sick in 2011, misdiagnosed for about 10 years, became agoraphobic, wrote as a therapy, wrote as something to kind of one day try to explain to my kids, and I thought I'll gift them these short stories. Uh, Fast forward, showed it to a couple friends. They said, "Man, you should really shop this around." Found a publisher who liked it and believed in it, and they helped me kind of rework it from a collection of short stories to a novel. And yeah, it's a fictional book about a Marco who we both have multiple sclerosis. That Marco didn't have things get better, whereas thankfully in real Marco's life, medication is extremely powerful. I feel like it's a very awesome time because there are so many great medications out there. And so yeah, so I wrote this book. Started to do readings. The book is extremely sad. It goes from bad to worse. The readings then turned into, me kind of doing jokes. There's a part of the book where, when dealing with a very traumatic situation, fictional Marco tells a joke, and I tried to make something positive out of it. And so, yeah, that's in a nutshell, how the book came to be, and a little bit about myself. Down here in San Antonio, Texas. After reading about you, Dr. Brown, I very much want to venture out to North Carolina. And so yeah. But in a nutshell, that's Marco.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I am sorry to hear about the diagnosis. My ex-wife, my wife that I was married to for a lot of years, actually was diagnosed with that as well. So I'm familiar with it. Hopefully, you are in remission now. I hope.
Yeah, and it, one of the things that I've loved, Dr. Brown, because it was an awful 10 years while everything was going.
Right.
So I want to say in the past month or so, I've probably done close to 20 podcasts. And I think you are probably now the 11th person that has had someone very close who
Yeah.
also had it. And so it's been one of those interesting things to say, like, it's such an awkward disease, but it's such a prevalent disease,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yes.
And so, yeah, but yeah, no, yeah, I have relapse remitting. So I have my moments and then I get better. And then I have my moments and I get
Right.
better. But it's been a really long time since I've had a true flare up. So that's been a really
Good.
positive thing.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And it just gives you an extra added level of ability to connect with people, which I think is so important. So, what do you do vocationally, if you don't mind asking that, Marco?
No, I don't mind at all. So I do risk management. I've been a risk manager for financial institutions for, gosh, going on 17 years. And so I've gone between like a, risk management type work, product management type work. Um, and yeah, so very, very different. But I will say this is where the two collapse. So in in IT, the way that you release code is through what they call iterations, right? And so one of the things that I realized, so I my first degree was in English, and I feel like how I was taught to write through the university was not for me, right? I know a lot of folks who came out of there published, they did well using that methodology. But one of the things that I realized is I do better when applying the methodology of how code is released in how I write, right? So there's this layer of like, okay, this is the overarching idea of what I want to do. This is how I'm going to execute it. And then you break it down to these minute little details that then let you build out the scene, let you build out the dialogue, let you build out the scenario. And so it was weird that even though I have two separate worlds, I have one kind of fed into the other and gave me the opportunity to not be overwhelmed by the story, but instead find an ability to break the story down into these little pieces that were easier for me to consume and how to write than had I just tried to put everything out. I'm not your typical writer. I have what you would call um, moments of, so when I write for myself, I can go months without touching a piece of paper. I can, even as a reader, there are long periods where I won't even pick up a book. And then all of a sudden it just becomes this very focal point of that's all I want to do is read it. That's all I want to do is write. But one of the things, whenever, so after I got out of the creative side and had to realize, okay, there's a business side to this, like I now have deadlines and stuff like that. That's where that business acumen kind of came in. And I said, okay, well, let's break this down to try to like actually accomplish what I was trying to do. I don't know how you are, Dr. Brown, but at a certain point, I feel without the ability to kind of cut it, you can constantly keep
Oh yeah,
revising the story,
for sure,
right? And so,
for sure.
and so that's where it helped. Because if not this, if I actually, I just did a podcast where the gentleman said, I'm curious for you to go back and look at your original versions of the story. And I did, and it was a totally different story back then. And so, that's been one of the things that I find beneficial, right? Because at the end of the day, you got to put the pen down and let the work just be, right? Whether it's
Right.
liked, not liked, or so on.
It sounds like that. I could see where, obviously, as a systems guy, you're a left brain thinker, very pragmatic, very systematized, and I can hear that in the description in which you wrote this book. And I think for you, that absolutely worked, and that's a wonderful thing. And to break it down into those pieces, what the book itself is written in what person, first or third or
Third, it's
third
third
person?
person. Yeah, the
Okay.
original version was first person, and I
Okay.
realized that it was so hard to, and you spoke about this, and I forgive me, I forgot her name. But I believe she was out in San Francisco. She was a law student. She had put together a book, but um, you know, when I did first person, there was too much of me in there, and I didn't want that, right? And so when I created it third person, I was able to kind of separate myself, and in a weird way, it became therapeutic because it allowed me to sit with the version of Marco that never got better. And so, it was a really cool exercise. But yeah, when I go to the old writings, it's all, first person, very, Raymond Carver-ish kind of, the thing. And so yeah, that was a unique twist to it.
It's an interesting thing. I always like to ask that question because I think I don't in my books. I have like right now I have two series, active series that I'm writing in. One of them's written in first person and one is in third. And so that plays games with your mind. So,
Hmm.
and I can relate to what you said about changing, because I remember many years ago writing a book, and I wrote the first draft and it was in first person. And after reading it, I realized that I need to add a different perspective. So I went back and rewrote the whole book, basically adding another person and changed it to third person, and it became two stars of the show, if you will. So I don't think people have any idea how that process goes, and how a writer like you said that you went back and looked at your first draft, how different they are from the final draft. But you also said something that's really important, Marco, and you said that you could continue to go down the rabbit trail of rewriting and adjusting and writing and adjusting and never finish. And I've always said for 25 years, when people ask me the difference between a writer and an author, I don't know if you've heard this on my podcast before, but my answer is always the same. A writer writes, an author finishes. And to
Mm,
me,
I love that.
it- that to me, in my mind, that is the definition between the two. Both of them are writers, but the author finishes. And so in this, I read in some notes that you found this to be kind of therapeutic. Is that right? In the fact that you were able to step away and write it this way?
Correct. So the way that I came to visualize it is if I wrote it in the first person, I almost felt like the story it took on that child perspective. If I wrote it in the third person, it took on a parent perspective.
Okay.
And I don't know if that makes sense, but it was one of those things where, I would sit, I would, get in my feelings and just again. So the way that I originally started was what I wanted the main characters to be were emotions, right? Solitude, anger, resentment, sadness. And then I thought the characters, the dialogue, those are the colors of the paint that tries to make the overarching image of that emotion, right? And so when it came down to it, I couldn't do that from a first person because I felt like again it was very childlike. It was only what I see matters. Whereas when I was able to pull it back to the third person type, I was able to bring in other things. And then, there's a story of the neighbors, right? There's a story of the neighbors' kids. There's a story, from my kids' perspective. If in first person I did that, it felt like a Bukowski novel where you realize this guy's a jerk, right? And I wish I knew what everyone else, was feeling when they interacted with him. And again, I feel like in a weird way, fictional Marco, I was able to depict him better by the perspective that others had of him, as opposed to just how he saw the world. And so I thought
Absolutely
that that
sense.
was a great exercise because if you look at all my old writings, none of them ever took on that third person perspective. It was always first person.
Right, right. Well, and part of that was because you were doing it as a healing exercise, a journaling exercise. So you were getting those feelings out, and those typically are obviously first person. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit, because people are probably yelling at me on the podcast now saying, "Well, Keith, tell us what the book's about." I mean, you've danced around a little bit. Tell us, if you
Mm-hmm.
had to describe the book, what is this story about, so they can get their heads around it.
Yeah. So this story is about a fictional Marco who lives a life of solitude, is deeply troubled with alcohol, is troubled with faith, is troubled with connecting with relationships. The original title of the story was The Long Goodbye because I felt like fictional Marco said goodbye before he had to, right? Even though life was happening, he had already reserved himself to just live in the worst case scenario. I think we live in a time where if you open up any social media, you're going to find people selling you something. And what they want to sell you is a better person than I think you feel like, even though you're probably a great person, there's always this notion of like, well, you could be this, you could be that. And I've always struggled with that because someone has to not achieve what they want. And to me, that's what the story was. On one hand, I wanted to show that sometimes the story is that it's not a good story, but I wanted the reader to look and say, like, man, if you only knew all these beautiful things that that fictional Marco had around him that he didn't grasp onto, right? He didn't appreciate it. That's on one hand. On the other hand, though, back to your question about therapy, I wanted to envision what it was like hypothetically in my life if I never got better. And I wanted to sit with that person and say, if this is my story, if one day this is not fiction and ends up being my story, I need to be okay with it. And so, I tell people, don't, I've gotten booked for podcasts where it's like self-help podcasts and they reach out and I think, you didn't read the book, did you? Because it's not really a self-help book. And that's okay because sometimes I think we better ourselves with realizing that sometimes things don't get okay. And sometimes uh, becoming accepting of that might in and of itself be a healing aspect to what you're trying to do. And so, yeah, the book is about that. So in real life, I have two little girls. They're 11 and 13. In the book, same names, fictional. They're much older. Um, there's again, it's that Marco struggling with connecting with his kids, connecting with relationships, with family. Um, just really struggling to allow himself to continue to try to find the positive in things.
Got you. And for the first time, and I can't believe we haven't said this already, but give us the title, the current title of the book. What is it called?
Oh, correct. Sorry. Within normal limits.
Within Normal Limits. Okay. And so if you had to say, I wrote this book and I want to reach a certain audience, or is there a person that you think this book was written for, besides yourself? And I think we all do that to some degree. But who do you think this book would most apply to? Do you have any idea?
Um, I think so. If you're a literary nerd, my hope is that someone who loves short stories, because again, in theory, you could pick up any chapter, and my hope is that even though you may not know the whole picture, every chapter you could be like, "Gosh, I got something out of that." So, from a literary, nerd perspective, I'd love that to be a demographic I strike a chord with.
Okay.
From a basic human level, I think anyone that is struggling and wants to spend time with someone who is struggling, I think that would also be someone that I hope to connect with. Again, ironically, I've done readings, I've read a little bit of the book. You can hear people tearing up. I hated that because I thought you probably found babysitters, you probably took time off of work, you came out to read it and you got sad, right? And so I turned it into the stand-up thing. And now I get invited to go do stand-up routines around town. And so there's also this humor aspect to the book that says, like, hey, in you know, I sometimes feel like humor is that ability to say I'm not afraid, right?
Oh
That
yeah, for
notion
sure.
that, um, and so I think, listen, I don't expect. So here's a really interesting point that I think you just made me realize, Dr. Brown. When I wrote this book was written for my kids because I thought when they're older and they're like, why didn't dad leave the house? I thought, well, at least dad made this book, right? And he gifted us this book. The weird thing is that I wrote it for no one. It was just something to waste time because I wasn't doing anything. But now that I'm writing a book, where the guy's a larger personality, very well known. It's weird because now I do have an audience, and now what you're asking me is like, who's your audience? It's such a different world going from, just being in these four corners with nothing to do with writing, and then one where it's like, hey, I have to appeal to these folks, right? I have to hit these certain chords in order for it to resonate with them. And so I wish I had a better answer for you for within normal limits because I do think it was just written in a silo and it just happened to resonate with some people.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
well, the reason I was asking that, and the point that I would like to, maybe suggest is the fact that based on what I'm hearing and based on, and honestly, listener, I have not read the book yet, and that's just an honest statement. But I from what you have told me and what you've described, I can see how there's a lot of people in the world today that are dealing with a lot of junk. There's a
yeah,
lot of people in the world today that are hurting big time. And so sometimes reading something like this, now we want to obviously expose ourselves to uplifting things and positive things, and that
100%.
that's part of the healing process. We know that. I mean, I've been doing coaching and mentoring and all kinds of stuff for almost 35 years. But having said that, I also know that sometimes in material that is like this, that's honest, that's raw, that's painful, it gives people sort of an affirmation that, I'm not alone in my hurt. I'm not alone in my suffering. This gives me a sense of belonging that somebody else out there understands me. So I could see how it would be very helpful to someone right now who is hurting, um, to know that, there's somebody else that thinks like I do, basically, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Would that at all apply to your work, you think?
I think you said what I was trying to say a million times better. Yes, I think, we all want these lives that are comfortable and pain-free. And yeah, you're spot on. It is, MS is the specific illness that was here, but I've talked to people with heart problems, with, any type of issue. And sometimes it's so hard to even convey to their loved ones of like what they're going through. And I think sometimes we fear looking crazy or, you know, um, in my culture, so I'm Mexican, in my culture, MS isn't like a really big thing, you know. I have an uncle who just passed away recently, and I love him, even to date, but I remember he was super sympathetic, but he thought MS was something to do with bones. And so he was real sweet and he would bring me milk and calcium and stuff like that. And it's just one of those things where sometimes when we can't make that connection, a book like this might help to realize, like to your point, you're not alone, right? It sometimes it's a lonely road, and this is a testament to that.
Maybe if somebody sees themselves in this character, they can also see as well the opportunities that this character, like you said, didn't grasp hold of, didn't see. And maybe that in itself might be a way of person saying, wow, maybe I'm not seeing all the things around me. Maybe I'm not seeing the opportunities. Maybe I'm not seeing the possibilities. So I could see how, even though the book you said was very sad and very negative, and it didn't play out like your life is, hopefully play it out, I could see how even that could be used to help someone get better. So
Yeah,
um,
I hope
you know
so.
I
I hope so.
yeah, yeah. So and now you're doing, which is kind of interesting because writing from this and this whole subject, and then you started, how did did you ever do comedy in the past, or was this direct result of the book? I mean, I've done comedy. I don't know how you go from this to comedy. I'm interested in how that transition worked.
Yeah, uh so in the book, so okay, let me answer first. So I had a really, like a million other people, I had a really rough upbringing. And one of the things that I noticed was my family's really funny. They were extremely poor. They had awful things happen. But one of the things that was just constant was humor. My great grandmother, who is referenced in the book, so the character goes to a funeral, and the way he copes with it is he tells a very dirty joke that the individual who passed loved, right? And so my great grandmother, just her. I mean, I was just surrounded by funny people that I think a were trying to make light of the awful things that were happening, and b humor is such a great way to neutralize the situation. And so I've always been known to kind of be the funny guy, but I think I did maybe like two open mics before COVID, before anything. But again, I would go and I would say, like, listen, guys, this is a very sad story. Like, I have copies if you guys want to buy it, but there's a point in the book where the character says a joke. So here's a bunch of jokes. And from there, it resonated. And at first, people were like, wait, what? Because they had read the book, they came out to the support and things like that. And then it was just the craziest thing because you make these connections, like this comedian, he had a festival here in town, invited me to go sell merch and get to know people. And uh, it just, I think some of the funniest people, and not to say that I am, but I think some of the funniest people have had the most tragic things happen to them.
Absolutely.
And I
Absolutely.
think that, it was just kind of, I always had that tool in my pocket to diffuse with humor. And then I just kind of saw an opportunity. The product manager side of me came out and said, "Hey, you have an ability to enhance this as well." And so it came out that way. And so and this book that I'm writing with the comedian, it's really hard too because there's different forms of comedy, and we're writing a youth horror book, and so that but you have to have humor in there. And um but yeah, I think I've always had it, but it was just an opportunity to bring people in. I think I can be vulnerable and talk about my illness, and I'll probably, in my experience, I'll connect with a few people. If I say a joke, I feel like I show vulnerability because there's this like, what if no one laughs, right? But he did it
Right.
anyways.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of develop these really amazing friendships and connections. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I just kind of felt like both personalities synced on the same opportunity.
Yeah. And I don't think it's that unusual because, I've been in the, whether you may not know this, Marco, but I do all this professional stuff and the writing that I do. But the other hat that I wear is I have been a comedy magician for about 25 years. I've toured all over the country. So I understand. And people get really surprised when they hear, my professional, you know, persona that I try to put out all the time. And then they go see me on stage and it's kind of like, what? So I understand how, that can be jarring, So I get that. But I also know, having hung out with a lot of comedians over my career, that a lot of them are very people that are going through a lot of hard stuff, and they've
Mhm.
gone through a lot of hard stuff, and a lot of that hard stuff has brought out the comedy. I mean, a lot of it is based on the hard stuff, and it's their, like you said, it's their way to diffusing, it's their way of connecting, it's their way of making light and feeling appreciated. So there's so many levels of that, so I really appreciate that so much. And I'm really excited for you because I know getting that first book out into the world is one of the most wonderful experiences. And
Thank you. Yes.
I try to always ask that question because it's been, gosh, I don't know, close to 20 years or so since I had my first. So I want to ask you, that very moment when you held your book in your hand for the very first time, what was that like?
I just cried. Um, I feel that out of all the bad and lonely times, so I always give credit. So I've been married twice. My first wife's mother knew how lonely I was. Um, and so she would call me and just read. She would just put me on the phone and read whatever random book she had in front of her, and I would just listen because she knew that I wasn't doing anything. And I made this strong connection with her. And I believe in my book. I believe in my craft. And so I just cried because I thought like, hey, you know, that part of me is done with. And I had hope to make connections. Fast forward, and I mean, Dr. Brown, like I genuinely see you as a friend. Like to me, like, I feel that I've been able to connect with people on a very profound way. And when I held the book, I believed in myself enough to know that's what's going to come out of this is I'm going to make these very powerful connections, emotional connections. And that's really all that I can really ask from the from the book. And it was just an incredible thing. Um, and my kids are beyond supportive of it, and that was really awesome to see. Um, and just I don't know, it's really hard to explain um, that feeling when something that's just in your mind becomes a tangible thing you can hold.
Yeah.
Um, that's a powerful thing.
You've done
Yeah.
something that many people have wanted to do and not a lot of people do. So congratulations, Marco.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
One more time. Give me the title of the book one more time.
Sure. Within normal limits,
Within normal limits.
which, yeah, if folks are interested to read, you can find it pretty
Do you
much
have it? Do
any.
you for YouTube for the YouTube viewer because we're going to have it on audio podcast and YouTube if that's okay with you.
Of
Um,
course.
can you do you have a copy there?
Not in front of me, but I can
Okay,
send
all
you
right.
an image.
That's
Um,
okay.
but
I was just going to let you hold it up.
oh
Just
no,
hold,
no, I
like Simba the lion. You were going to hold it up
yeah.
for the.
Yeah.
But that's
um,
okay. That's okay. They'll find it.
but every online retailer you can think of, Barnes and Noble, Target, Amazon, I mean Walmart, it's available every online retailer. To connect with me, you can go to wnlmarco.com. Um, and you'll find all my socials there, how to connect with me in general. Um, and yeah,
Okay.
but within normal limits is the name of the book.
All right. Perfect, Marco. Thank you. Hang on to the line for just a moment. Okay, folks, you've heard this powerful story. I hope that you've connected with Marco as I have. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Also, in the show notes, you're going to find the link. I will make sure it's there and the title of the book and everything so you can find it. I do encourage you to go check it out and check Marco out. And thank you so much for listening to this podcast or viewing it on YouTube. It does mean a lot to me. And the one thing that it means to most to me is the fact that you are supporting authors who are trying to do this craft and give you this beautiful offering, which is their heart, their minds, and their work. And I appreciate you, dear listener. Until next time, may you be blessed. May you have a great day and keep reading.